Ladies and gentlemen, the theme of the first panel today is Looking Out. And may I now invite members of the first panel to come up on stage. I'll say a little bit about this panel as the speakers are making their way up. We have 3 speakers, and as the title of this session suggests, they will consider the possibilities if key prevailing assumptions about the external environment which have guided Singapore's approach to public policy are no longer valid. Chairing this panel is a highly regarded diplomat familiar to you all and a person very dear to us at IPS. May I invite Professor Tommy Koh, IPS Special Advisor, to introduce this panel and the speakers. Professor Koh.
Thank you very much, Lynn. My good friend Janadas, my good friend Gillian, who is the designer and choreographer of this year's conference, friends and family of IPS. I want to remind the timekeeper that we are starting this panel 20 minutes late. So if I don't exactly end on time at 10:15, I hope you will be tolerant and forgiving. We are 5 days away from the new Lunar New Year, and I want to take this opportunity to wish everyone peace and prosperity in the new year of the rooster. I hope that in this new year, our hopes will be realized and some of our fears and worries as a result of some recent developments in the world will prove to be unfounded. I thank Janadas and Gillian for inviting me to chair this panel. It is always a pleasure to listen to Janadas, who is brilliant and eloquent. And at the risk that he might not invite me back next year, I wish to pick a quarrel with him on one of his points. Janadas said Southeast Asia, unlike China and India, does not have a civilization of its own. This is a view often perpetrated by scholars in the West who regard Southeast Asia as syncretic, as a meeting place between cultures and influences, as having a civilization that's derivative and not original indigenous. I disagree with that. I have somewhere else written at some length that this is not true. Southeast Asia has a civilization of its own. If you divide Southeast Asia into mainland Southeast Asia and maritime Southeast Asia, I would remind Janadas that in mainland Southeast Asia, you have ancient civilizations of the Khmer, of the Thais, the Burmese, and the Vietnamese, which had existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And in maritime Southeast Asia, Professor Anthony Reid, in his brilliant books, have told us that for hundreds of years, you had polities, maritime polities that had existed, had the culture of their own, that had traded with one another. So Janadas, forgive me for disagreeing with you, but I hold a view which is contrary to the view of the West, that Southeast Asia does have a civilization of its own. And now, I want to say something about this panel. This panel consists of 3 wise men. But I was a bit disappointed that Gillian did not include in it at least one wise woman. My disappointment in not having a woman on this panel is, however, compensated by the fact that this is probably the oldest panel of this conference. Professor Huang Ganghu is 86 years young. And I'm not a young rooster anymore. I'm 79 years old. I think in choosing Prof. Huang and me to be on this panel, Gillian is sending her boss, Janadas, two messages. One, it is time for Singapore to abolish a statutory retirement age. And the second message is not just to Janadas, but to the whole of Singapore, that it is time for us to combat the manifestations of ageism in Singapore. Professor Wang Gungwu is someone I've admired all my life. I regard him as my teacher, and we have asked him to answer a very difficult question. Since the Treaty of Westphalia, we have lived in a world of nation states. What if the nation state is no longer the organizing unit of the international community? Gungwu, that is a question that Gillian has posed to you. And now, please come here and enlighten us with your answer.
Thank you, Professor Koh. I'm not sure I want to advertise the fact that I'm probably one of the oldest people in this room, but I do have to say this, that it reminds me of the fact that when you live so long, you get rather obsessed with history and the past. And when Gillian asked me to speak, I assume she knew that I would be more interested in the past than in the future. But of course, historians are always tempted to talk about the future, so every now and then we forget ourselves and make stupid mistakes about the future. And I can assure you that no historians have ever been right predicting the future. So let me begin with that warning to all of you not to take me too seriously. The other thing, of course, is that when Gillian, Dr. Koh asked me, I wondered whether there's an answer to this question. She assured me that she didn't have a fixed answer, but she didn't, fortunately for me, she didn't expect me to provide an answer either, but encouraged me to raise the question so that you can think about it. As a matter of fact, fundamentally, the question already has been answered by Janadas this morning when he described the very exceptional position of Singapore. His survey of the origins and the hard periods of Singapore's growth that has made it so exceptional reminds us that if Singapore is called a nation state, then the question of what is a nation state is in question itself. Because if this is so exceptional, what is a nation state? And this is where my historical instincts come back. Because the city-state that he describes it, of course, is not new. There have been city-states in the past, but they've not always had a very happy history. That's one. Secondly, nation-states we've taken rather for granted as being something that we live with all the time. But actually, as you look into history, and you don't have to look that far, and it doesn't have to be so many very thick volumes to read, the fact is that nation-state is a very new idea. In the context of our human history, or recorded history anyway, of about 5,000 years, the nation-state is a very recent thing indeed, a very young baby on the horizon, so to speak. Let me put it this way. If you talk to most people, most of my colleagues in universities, political scientists in particular, philosophers, they would say the nation-state started with the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century. And we have therefore had, as it were, nation-states with us for more than, 300 years. But if you look closely at it, and I have been forced to do so by Gillian to think again about this concept of a nation-state, I'm not sure that is true. In fact, I'm more and more convinced that we're living with the myth that the nation-state began over 300 years ago. That Treaty of Westphalia was drawn up not between nation-states. There was no such thing before that. They were drawn up by a number of kingdoms and empires that have fought themselves to a standstill for hundreds of years and decided that they should stop killing each other and sit down and talk. And when they did so, they finally agreed that it was stupid to go on killing and worked out a treaty to draw up the existing borders that everybody would then look after very carefully and treat as sovereign. But remember, the treaty was between kingdoms and empires. There was no such thing as a nation state. Since then, we've built up the idea that that was where it began. That treaty enabled nation states to emerge out of it all. And it is true, some of the small states in that context began to have safe borders, and they did survive for a long time. But remember, in the end, it was really a matter of agreement among powerful empires that drew up that treaty. And in fact, those empires became even bigger. Like the Spanish Empire was very big already, the British came, and the French Empire, even the Dutch, a small country, had its own empire. And then there were the Russian Empire, the Tsarist ones, various others in Central and Eastern Europe. And we can go on. And of course, the famous great Ottoman Empire, which was one of the greatest empires of its time. All these were empires. And it was really a treaty among empires not to go on fighting each other. And the small countries benefited from the fact that these empires had agreed to do something very sensible. That is the background. So that's why I say it's a myth to believe that nation states began in the 17th century is really very misleading. The second myth, and I have to now call it a myth, is that then in the 19th century, with the invention of international law, and all the lawyers after the Treaty of Vienna, the Congress of Vienna in particular, sat down and worked out some more permanent understandings of what sovereignty meant and what the laws meant and why people should not invade each other and all the ways of countries should behave and so on. And there are people who would argue that with international law, once you have a system like that, then nation states became possible. I think that is an acceptable proposition. But it's not the same thing as saying that nation states really began in the 19th century with the establishment of a set of international laws that most countries agreed on. Because if you look at the international law that was written at the time, throughout the 19th century, it was really about the agreement between very powerful empires. The countries that really mattered, the so-called great powers of the time, were the British Empire, the French Empire, the Russian Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, and a few others. But it was really among them. And in fact, even among them, there were classifications. Those empires that were recognized as being civilized, and some of these empires were not regarded as civilized. In fact, there was a long period when the Chinese Empire, for example, was not a member, did not participate. It was only about 2 decades after the Opium War, when the Chinese had been defeated, that the Chinese were allowed to join, as it were, as an empire that was recognized by the other empires. And the Mughal Empire didn't last very long anyway by that time, following the Indian Mutiny. And the Ottoman Empire was very quickly, soon afterwards anyway, dismembered. And in fact, of course, this Treaty of Vienna and the international law did not manage to avoid wars. We had 2 world wars, very destructive world wars. But the funny thing is that the most destructive part of it was, eventually, after 2 world wars, what it destroyed was not the little small nation states that had been emerging slowly, but it destroyed all those empires. So the age of empires basically came to an end at the end of the Second World War. And for the first time, I think, since 1945, we can actually talk about something like a nation state. And if I read the question properly from Dr. Koh, is it the key organizing unit in the world? I've been forced to think about it. Is it? I'm not sure it has ever been the key organizing unit in the world. And I don't want to disagree with the question, but one should always answer a question as best one can. I think it's a fair question, but when the more I thought about it, they realized that, in fact, I was trying to work out a scenario when the world did not have nation states. I thought that was the positive way of looking at it. But I found that as I thought about it more and more, I'm not sure that the nation state has ever been a key organizing unit of the world. It may have been one of the units, but in the end, we have always been looking at, to begin with, powerful kingdoms and empires, later on, powerful countries, the great powers, which were in themselves empires, who determined the shape of the world. And even after 1945, when we turned around and depended upon the United Nations organization and looked to the United Nations to interpret international law, to make sure that it was possible to defend those small little countries from the big ones, we have been facing tremendous difficulties ever since. From the beginning, it was stated that 5 of those countries were exempt from some of the basic rules of the United Nations pertaining to nation states. 5 of them were kind of superpowers already, given their particular position in the Security Council. And since then, you might say that with the Cold War and so on, these 5 were reduced to two superpowers for several decades. And then with the fall of the Soviet Union, we're down to 1 superpower. And that's what we have been facing ever since the 1990s. 1 superpower, and lots of other little powers, some big, some small, but none of them really having or could possibly match the kind of power wielded by the 1 superpower. That is the reality. But of course, we hope and expect the United Nations, backed by international law, to provide these smaller countries with the safety, the guarantees of sovereign rights and so on, and we of course still are hoping. There is no guarantee. What has happened since 1945? We've seen a number of so-called nation states divide up into other nation states. There's very little instability in the borders of the so-called nation states. I mean, in my own lifetime, to see the way Pakistan was divided very quickly into 2 states. I mean, there were many others I can think of, or other efforts to change the borders, to make them 2 states become 1 state, reunification of Germany, reunification of Korea has been talked about. Ever since I can remember, people talked about reunification of Korea. But there was a reunification of Vietnam. And the Vietnam reunification wasn't divided for too long, but it was reunified by war. And a very bloody war in which unexpected results was that the United States actually allowed the Vietnamese to win and bring the 2 parts of Vietnam together. These borders were changing. Well, Janadas has already reminded us the shifting borders around Malaysia were matters of great concern for many years. In fact, we've only had a more or less stable border since 1965. For the 20 years after the Second World War, there was no clear borders in this part of the world. And even in questions of independence, Indonesia has to fight very hard to make Indonesia the one country that it is, not only against the Dutch, but against secessionist movements inside Indonesia, which fortunately for all of us, all of them failed. But it is not at all something that we can take for granted, that the nation state, once given its sovereignty, will always be able to maintain it. I can go on listing. The most recent ones, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and what is worse, not to anyone's expectation, the division of Yugoslavia. What kind of nation state was Yugoslavia that it could turn up into 5 different nation states almost immediately after the fall of or the death of Tito, its ruler? Now that is a very cruel reminder to us that what we're looking at, the nation state, is still very much work in progress. It's still an ideal. We hope that international law, the United Nations, and all these institutions that we have created, the world has tried to create for the last 100 years or so, we hope that they will succeed in protecting this nation state. So with that background, you can see that to answer this question becomes very, very difficult indeed, because I have to start by asking if the nation state is an organizational unit that can really protect itself. So in the end, we are up against the same principles. Big countries, medium countries, small countries. And how they work out their relationship among themselves becomes more and more significant as the distribution of power doesn't actually get more equally distributed. If anything, we see them grouping into great powers more than the small powers. I have the feeling, and it's a sinking feeling that I don't enjoy, that small powers are getting weaker relatively to big powers over the last 50 years. And this is not a comfortable feeling for me. And in that context, what are the possibilities? The scenario possibles are very limited. I had put down something for Gillian, and then I looked back on it and I said, I don't know that any of those scenarios are going to cheer anybody up this morning. I better not go into them and make you even more miserable. It's been bad enough in the rain this morning when I came. But thank you very much for listening to me. I have no answer. The answers will have to come from you. Thank you.
I've learned something, Gillian, which is that when you invite an economist to speak, you never get a straight answer because they'll say on the one hand this and on the other hand this. If you ask a historian to speak, you wouldn't get a straight answer either because they say, well, a historian can't predict the future. Gang Hu, thank you very much for your very interesting answer to Gillian's question. May I ask you a question, and then if you can think about it, so during a Q&A session, if you could respond to my question. Being a UN man, I've spent most of my life working in the context of nation states. There are 197 member states of the UN, so I'm a nation state man. And the nation state is, for me, still the key organizing unit of our world. But I also recognize that there are some developments that challenge the authority of nation states. One challenge is that some states have decided to pool their sovereignty, to become a member of a larger unit like the European Union. So that's one. Pooling sovereignty, creating a larger unit. On the other hand, there's the opposite development. There's a wish for people to belong to smaller, more homogeneous, more comfortable units. And so, for example, Czechoslovakia broke up into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The Scots are determined to secede from the United Kingdom. The Catalonians are determined to secede from Spain, and so on. And the third development, Gang Hu, is this. Jana Das, in his opening speech, said Singapore is unique in that we are the only city that's also a country. But if you look at history, there are long periods when city-states was the organizing unit in ancient Greece, but also in Northern Europe, in the Baltics. There was a long period when cities, port cities, were the organizing unit. There was something called the Hanseatic League. So my question to Gang Hu is, with the diminution in the authority of nation states, are you likely to see the rebirth of a league of city-states, of port cities? Now my job is to introduce the next speaker who has been asked an even more challenging question. Will globalization fail? It's a very challenging but very timely question. I never expected to live long enough to hear a president of the United States speak against free trade and globalization and in favor of protectionism. But I just read to you a line from the inaugural speech of President Trump. And I quote, "Protection will lead to great prosperity and strength." Isn't it amazing that the leader of the biggest democracy and capitalist system in the world is a champion for protectionism? And on the other hand, the leader of the biggest communist country in the world, has gone to Davos and tell everybody that I champion free trade, globalization. We live in a strange and confusing and contradictory world. So to answer this important and timely question, Gillian has picked someone which, according to IPS propaganda, is the smartest man in a shell company. Dr. Kong Cho Un is Singapore's gift to Shell. He's the chief political analyst in a global business environment team. He's based in London. He has got 20 years of experience in scenario planning and played a very important role, key role, in the scenario planning in 95, 98, 2001, 2005. He is a member of the Brains Trust of the Evian Group. He's also on the board of a very famous business school in Lausanne, the International Institute for Management Development. He's an adjunct faculty member of Chatham House and an associate fellow of the Said Business School at Oxford University. It is a great pleasure to invite Dr. Kong to come to the podium and answer this timely and difficult question. Are we seeing the end of globalization?
Thank you, Professor Koh. We need to begin by asking ourselves, why this question now? Would we have seriously considered it a decade ago, even a year ago? Well, we live, as Prof. Koh was saying, in strange times. And I have to say, it would have been unlikely that we would have conjured up this question at this conference a year back. But today, with an increasingly strident nationalism, a building of walls, a closing of doors, and indeed a closing of minds, concerns over globalization failing are growing. We have to take this question with the utmost seriousness, and it's a question that's especially germane for today. The great era of globalization that now appears to be drawing to a close began with the post-war recovery of Europe and Japan from the mid-20th century onwards. Then, of course, we had the beginnings of growth of the so-called Asian tigers, including, I have to say, Singapore, from the 1970s, followed by the opening up of China with Deng Xiaoping's reforms from 1978. Thatcher, Ronald Reagan spearheaded a radical market liberalization in the 1980s. And we then saw the collapse of Soviet communism from 1989 to 1991. It seemed to many people that a brave new world of progress, peace, and harmony was dawning. Globalization was like an inexorable force through the spread of new technology and market liberalization, a fundamental cornerstone belief shaping our understanding of the global environment in which we live. Francis Fukuyama wrote his famous end of history thesis. In Shell, in the 1990s, we talked about TINA. There is no alternative to globalization, market liberalization, and the spread of technology. But at the same time, and this is what is relevant for today, at the same time, even in the 1990s, we recognized that globalization carried within it the seeds of its own possible destruction. In 1995, we came up with two scenarios. One of them, we called it Just Do It, celebrated the continued advance of globalization and the spread of global markets. The other scenario, presciently we gave it a Chinese name, Dawo, or Big Me, argued that globalization would come up against governments who have their own concerns, which they would want to protect, and societies which would look to preserve their cohesion, and that the politics of identity would act to filter and to restrain globalization. In 2001, we highlighted another concept, that of heartland versus edges. A division between, on the one hand, traditional values rooted in culture and history, and on the other hand, an outward orientation and global identity, but in danger of being disconnected from its heartland roots. This division, we noted, ran through countries, societies, and even poignantly through individuals. This understanding gave us two new scenarios. Prism, a story of heartlands resisting globalization, motivated by forces that do not have their roots in economic soil, and business class, a cosmopolitan global elite setting the terms on which the world would run. These scenarios led, of course, in markedly different directions. That was 2001. Now, the period of globalization that we look back on, in a way, came to an end, signaled by the Western financial crisis of 2008. But in 2008, in Shell, we switched focus. We highlighted the critical challenge that climate change poses for us. In our global scenarios of that year, we made clear that we cannot continue using energy in the same way that we have always done, and that a critical energy transition is inevitable. Climate change has always been part of our scenarios. Let me make that clear. Going all the way back to the 1990s, but from 2008 onwards, climate and the implications for energy became front and center stage of our global long-term scenarios. In our current scenarios from 2013, we call them mountains and oceans, we repeated the challenge that we faced from climate change. But we also emphasize that simultaneously with facing a critical global energy transition, we also confront a range of other critical transitions in the global economy, in geopolitics, in governance. Recovery from the 2008 financial crisis has proved to be difficult. We sense there's no way of going back to what economists once fondly referred to as the Great Moderation. At the same time, we see a shift of geopolitical and economic power from west to east. This has proved highly disruptive to societies in the West, particularly to people who feel that they have somehow lost out in that shift. Economists, of course, measure that in terms of GDP, but it's more than GDP. It's a sense of identity. It's a sense of community. At the same time, it's proved highly invigorating and empowering to societies and to people who have won, who have gained from that process. But this is also disruptive, but in a different way. For ruling elites, particularly those who have grown too complacent with their entitlement to rule. We see people in all parts of the world demanding change from governing elites that have lost their legitimacy. The problem for many of these societies is, of course, that what the people want is themselves inchoate and confused. So what lies ahead? That's the question for us today. A number of critical transition points are coming together. Energy, of course, but also economic and political. And they're doing so in an increasingly interconnected world. We're moving into an era of volatile transitions, and globalization as we've known it will have to change. We may get a smooth transformation of the system, but transitions by their very nature are inherently unstable. Mao Zedong once said that a revolution is not a dinner party. We are moving into a more fluid geopolitical environment with much greater political uncertainty and the danger, I have to say this, of an increasingly confrontational world. The global order may well be moving into a period of disorder before, hopefully, the system gels together to establish a new order. How much disorder there will be, or how much order we might get in this transitional period, will depend on the choices that we as people and that our governments make. So will globalization fail? Let me be clear. The technological component of globalization, which increases connectivity, will not fail. Knowledge cannot be taken away, but technology is just the carrier of globalization. John Gray, the eminent English political philosopher who's worked with us over many years, has argued that globalization simply carries on, but it has no inherent tendency to promote either free markets or liberal democracy. What could and will change is our understanding of, and hence our attitudes toward, connectivity, with its promises and its perils. This in turn impacts on our practice of globalization, how we use globalization to shape the way we live, how we interact with others as individuals, as societies and states. Globalization therefore will change as the old model is seen to fail. Globalization itself doesn't fail. Rather, it's up to us and the choices that we will make, which will determine whether globalization shapes a world for the better or a world for the worse. Globalization could move in one of two possible directions. In one scenario, we call it mountains. It is states, nation states, who take the lead. Mountains is a world of state power. It is capitalist, but it is not liberal. Globalization carries on, but globalization slows as it increasingly collides with a resurgent nationalism. People don't trust markets. We see that in many parts of the world. They turn to governments to protect them from what they see as the destabilizing impacts of globalization. Nationalism, national competition intensify over time. But here's the rub. Countries will have to learn not to confront each other, but to get along with each other. Because only by working together will we be able to tackle the challenges of climate change, resource scarcity, global demographics that confront us all as a human global community. Tackling those problems requires hard choices. No one country, not even the most powerful, will be able to deal with them on its own. If we don't find a way to work together, we will fail, and the consequences will be profound. None of us can isolate ourselves from these consequences. In our other scenario, we call it oceans. It's people power rather than government that shapes globalization. A new, more vocal politics gathers momentum and pushes change. It's driven by an awakening and increasingly vigorous civil society challenging government, seeking solutions outside of the public sphere. The debate on climate change could take place between generations. The debate on education between parents and non-parents. Ruling elites are challenged by new information technology empowered netizens. This is a more decentralized, diffuse globalization. And over the next decade, as different countries and societies, each with their own history, each with their own agendas, engages with globalization, each will put its own distinctive cultural, social, economic, and political stamp onto it. Instead of Tina, there's no alternative. We'll have Tara, there are real alternatives. Globalization provides a menu of different choices. So to conclude, globalization is transmuting into new forms, very different from today, and posing a different set of opportunities and costs for us. It is how we negotiate these new challenges that will ultimately determine the form that globalization takes and our eventual fate as citizens, as nation states, and as the world. Thank you.
On climate change, I would remind Dr. Kong that President Trump is on record as having said during the campaign that climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese to fool the Americans. The question whether globalization will survive It's a very real question, you know? I mean, we see in Britain during the referendum, in the US election, angry voters who relatively not so well educated, live in the rural areas, who have suffered deprivation because their industries have become obsolete, the jobs have migrated, who are morally conservative and oppose what the liberals wish to do or have done. This is real, you know, this is real. So my question to you, Dr. Kong, is what can we do to satisfy these angry voters? And is there a danger that this phenomenon will spread from Europe and in America to Asia and even to here in Singapore? I think the most difficult question is the third question. And the question is, what if Singapore has to choose between the United States and China? And I would say, Gillian, that it may not be a hypothetical question, you know? It may not be a hypothetical question. Singapore's foreign policy is to be close to, but not aligned with any great power. But when great powers are confrontational, as appears to be very likely between the new Trump administration and China, then it narrows the room for a small country like Singapore. If President Trump unleashes a trade war with China, this will be a disaster for all countries in the world, and we will all suffer collateral damage. If President Trump encourages the pro-independence DPP government in Taiwan, this will have a repercussion on us. It already has a repercussion on us. I think the detention of the 9 Terex vehicles in Hong Kong has to do with the increasingly acrimonious relation across the straits and between Beijing and Washington. So we need a very wise man to answer this question. And we have in Professor Joseph Liao, a brave and wise man. He's the Dean of the Rajaratnam School of International Study. He's also the first Lee Kuan Yew Professor of Southeast Asian Studies at the Brookings Institution. Joe, come and answer the question.
Thank you, Prof. Koh, and thanks also to Janadas and Gillian for the invitation, I think, given Prof. Koh's warnings. Actually, I was thinking that my main job on this panel was basically one, and that was to bring down the average age of the panel, and I think I have succeeded. So that in itself. A second point. Just now, Prof. Wang's remarks, he mentioned about how historians are terrible at predicting the future. Well, there's one group of people who are worse than historians, and that's political scientists, of which I am one. Now, so the question posed to me is, what if Singapore has to choose between China and the United States? Let me first say that if you are here and hoping that I would give an answer in the form of who we should choose, then I want to apologize at the very outset. I'm going to disappoint you. But what I want to do is to take a step back and look at, excuse me, and look at this question and its implications. Now, before I do that, before we get into the what if, let's just spend a minute considering the what was or what used to be. I think it's fair to say, and there will be consensus on this, that since the end of the Cold War, we have had a strategic equilibrium in East Asia that has been centered on stable Sino-US relations. And that equilibrium has allowed the region to flourish economically, while at the same time keeping the centrifugal pressures of strategic competition very much at bay, or at least contained. There are, of course, concerns that things are unraveling and the situation is going to change, not least because of the inauguration of the Trump administration, and very real concerns that American interests and engagement in Southeast Asia is going to slow down, to recede. While at the same time, China continues to be assertive. China's assertiveness will continue to gather pace. There will obviously be positive elements to it, in the form of their economic outreach and investments into the region. But there's also another dimension to it, and that we have seen ever so often in recent times. I would call it political browbeating or diplomatic browbeating. Now, for Singapore, our leaders have always stressed the point that we should not be placed in a position where we have to choose between the two great powers. Yet it is the very backdrop that we are confronted with today, with all these uncertainties, that is sort of compelling us to consider this question, which is why we're doing that today. It doesn't help in a sense that if you look at the latest reporting on developments in Sino-Malaysian and especially Sino-Philippines relations, it's been cast precisely in this language, that the Malaysians have chosen or are choosing, and the Filipinos as well. So, but before we talk about the scenarios and the conditions governing this issue of choice, let us just take a step back, as I said. Now, this notion of choosing sides, it immediately conjures up images of a zero-sum game, right? A zero-sum game that involves trade-offs, where choosing one side means that you are automatically distancing yourself from another. We've, in a sense, seen this before during the Cold War, when there are two camps at odds with each other. Now, the question is whether present conditions, Trump aside, present conditions allows us to view things in that manner. And by present conditions, I mean a world which is increasingly interdependent, interconnected, and digital technology driven. I would submit to you that it is not so straightforward. And let me put down a few reasons why I think so, at least insofar as US-China relations are concerned. Number one, I think that Chinese leaders in private will grudgingly admit that the US has had a restraining hand on Japan and Taiwan in this region. And we have to bear in mind that relations with Japan and relations with Taiwan are very important, are consequential foreign policy issues for the US, have always been, as far as Asia policy is concerned, okay? So in other words, even if Beijing is interested to limit the strategic reach of the US into the region, that does not mean that it wants the US to entirely disengage from the region. We need to bear that in mind. Number two, while there should be little doubt that the Trump presidency is probably going to scale back on interest and commitment in the region, it is not likely to disengage on its own from the region entirely as well. I mean, yes, the halcyon days of the Obama's administration's pivot, those are gone, okay? Those are gone, not coming back anytime soon. But Trumpisms notwithstanding, I think the US not only still has much to offer to the region, but it still has much to gain from continued engagement in the region in terms of economics, in terms of security, and importantly, I think that senior cabinet officials and even Republican Party elders are aware of that, even if the president is a bit nonchalant about it. Number three, China is already an economic powerhouse with growing political influence. So omitting it, eliminating it from the regional equation is simply ludicrous, right? It's an impossible thing to imagine. And number 4, we need to remember that, rhetoric aside, the scope and depth of bilateral relations between the US and China have widened and deepened considerably over the years. You know, not too long ago, bilateral relations essentially focused on a small basket of issues, right? Cross-strait relations, exchange rates of the renminbi, bilateral trade. But over the last few years, it has expanded to a wider range of issues. Here we're talking about territorial disputes. We're talking about regional economic trade initiatives. We're talking about global issues like climate change, non-proliferation, counter-terrorism, cybersecurity, a whole range of issues. And the number of official and unofficial channels for them to discuss these issues have also increased. So simply put, this bilateral relationship, which at least to me is the most complex relationship between two great powers that the world has ever seen. And to sort of dismiss the way that they are intertwined and the way they overlap with each other, the interests of these two great powers intertwine and overlap with each other, I think it's much more complicated than that. But let me move on and now consider, if we insist to think about Singapore having to choose sides, what sort of conditions are we talking about? Or what sort of scenarios might throw up this challenge to Singapore where we have to choose sides? So in other words, let me contradict all that I have said earlier and draw up some scenarios. I have at least 5, there are probably more, but let me draw up 5. Number 1 is the election of an unpredictable, impulsive, self-absorbed, vengeful president in the US, which thankfully has not happened. Okay. Number 2, you have nationalist hawks tightening their grip on power in China. Now, these would be found predominantly, but not solely, in the PLA. And here we're talking about a segment of Chinese society that has no reservations when it comes to thinking, talking, and planning for conflict with the US. And more importantly, they have no patience to suffer the anxieties of small states, which may be caught in between. Okay? They believe that the rise of China is inevitable, and the US and its friends are basically standing in its way. Number 3, a serious breakdown in Sino-US relations, which obviously flows from the first 2 assumptions, right? And here we're talking about the situation that is back to the Cold War, and all those images conjured up by the discussions about the Thucydides trap come to mind. Number 4, perhaps an implicit agreement between the US and China to create spheres of influence. Not entirely, but here I'm talking about spheres of predominant influence, because I think it is quite unlikely that any of them are willing to cede entirely influence in a particular region to the other. Okay, and here perhaps the South China Sea would be an interesting litmus test of it, because I personally don't see the US, whether under Trump or even under Obama, really going out of its way for Philippine interests over a few features that tend to, most of them are submerged at high tide. And number 5, a failure of Singapore's diplomacy. For a good part of the post-Vietnam War era, Singapore worked hard not to end up in precisely this position that we are contemplating today. Okay, so we have to sort of consider that as well. Okay, now finally, if we were to choose, if Singapore had no choice but to choose, the question then is, on what terms do we choose? Let me offer some thoughts on this. Number 1, if we choose on the basis of interests, not countries, right? So the question has been posed in that respect, US or China. It's a cliche, but then it's worth reiterating that we are pro-interest, not pro-this power, not pro-that power. And certainly any choice that is made cannot be made at, figure of speech, gunpoint. Number two, there should be no interference in domestic politics involved. But I think this would be difficult because if we were to essentially capitulate and make concessions, it would be a slippery slope. It would be a slippery slope, and it would be a challenge for the government of the day in Singapore. And it's not just Singapore, it's any small state that finds itself in this position. Number three, we have to be mindful of our neighborhood. If making a choice means making concessions, we must be very careful of the signals that are being sent in the process of making that choice. Okay, we may send the wrong signals, or other states may read the wrong signals and draw wrong conclusions from our actions, i.e. that Singapore is a pushover. And I don't think it is in our interest to send that signal consciously or otherwise. Bear in mind, Singapore is not unfamiliar with bullies, right? And number four, we need to remember that the US and China are not the only major powers of consequence in the region. Again, the question has been cast in that way, US-China, and of course, the Sino-US relationship is going to be a key feature of regional affairs in the foreseeable future, but it is not going to be the only determinant of regional affairs. There are other external players around, and we have to continue deepening our relationships with them as well. And lastly, ASEAN. It's probably not the best time to talk about ASEAN unity. I mean, ASEAN has seen better days as far as its unity and cohesion are concerned. But nevertheless, we need to be mindful of the fact that small states in Southeast Asia are all facing the same challenge, the same dilemma. Okay, it's not something that Singapore itself is confronted with. Okay, other states in the region face a similar dilemma and are also pondering how to navigate the waters of great power politics. And I think it would be very useful for Singapore to not just look at it from a purely Singapore/national interest point of view, but also in relation and in cohesion with our neighbors who are also facing the same challenges. So on that note, I will stop.
Thank you, Joe. I think all of us would agree with Joe that for as long as possible, Singapore will try to avoid having to make this invidious choice of either siding with the United States or with China. But if the worst comes to the worst, then Joe's advice to Singapore is that if we have to decide, there must be some criteria, some basis on which we will make this decision. And he's given us 5, I think, no? Is it 5? Yeah. 5. He said 1, it must be based on a calculation of Singapore's interests. Second, there must be a promise by the great power not to interfere in our domestic politics. Third, we need to consider our neighbors' feelings. Fourth, ASEAN could be a buttress, that if ASEAN could remain united, could remain neutral, then this will help Singapore not to have to make this invidious choice. I agree with that. And maybe Ong Keng Yong can say something about this later. Then he said something else which puzzled me. He said, well, there are other options. Are there other great powers? Other great powers than the United States and China? So, Joe, who are you referring to? Are you referring to Japan or to India? So, my question to you then is, what other options does Singapore have? You know, or could we consider something that President Charles de Gaulle once proposed long time ago in the 1950s, which is that Southeast Asia should be recognized by all the great powers as a neutral region. Is that an option for Southeast Asia to become a neutral region, a neutralized? He made this during a state visit to Cambodia, you know. So I'm just putting this in a pot and ask Joe whether is that another option. So we have about 20 minutes for Q&A, but I'd like Prof. Wang to briefly respond to the question I posed to you, which is...
Which question?
Which question? Which is that the authority of the nation state is being challenged by three developments. One, some nation states are pooling their sovereignty and forming larger unions like the European Union. A second development is to become smaller, you know, to the breakup of the Czechoslovakia, the aspiration of the Scots to secede, the aspiration of the Catalonians to secede. So that's a second development. The third development is maybe we are beginning to see the rebirth of city-states, of port states, like the Hanseatic League, like the great city-states of ancient Greece.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your question, Professor Koh. I actually worked out a sort of scenario for Dr. Gillian Koh when I was asked to answer this question. I pulled back from it, not because I'm not prepared to speculate, but because I got carried away by other issues that involved the very nature of the nation state itself. But I do agree there are possibilities. For example, during the time when the great powers like the Soviet Union and the United States were in conflict and in tremendous tension, there were efforts to try and free ourselves from being dependent on either of the two. The first of them, of course, was Bandung in our part of the world, when people like Sukarno and Nehru and others in Africa got together to try and create a group of states that were not dependent on either the United States or the Soviet Union. Well, we know that that didn't really work out. I mean, a lot of efforts were made, something has survived. There's something called a non-aligned movement. When there's no more Cold War, who are you aligned with? You know, so it's pretty meaningless in some ways. But nevertheless, you can see that groups of small nations and middle-sized nations who don't want to depend on these powers have always tried to do something. So ever since 1945, ever since the Cold War started, that has been going on. But when the Cold War ended, the reasons for doing that became less obvious because you're not choosing between the two. So unless we're trying to reconstruct the second Cold War between the United States and China, which I hope we're not doing, but if we put it in that light, then maybe we'll have to go through a second stage of experimentation with the kind of groupings that Bandung Conference and the non-aligned movement tried to do. But that kind of neutralism that they offered came to nothing, to be quite frank. It came to nothing because it turned out to be very unrealistic. So the alternative to that, and I can work out, you can see European Union, ASEAN, they're all struggling. And one of the reasons why they're struggling is because they all have some notion of the nation state, which to my mind is outdated. In the case of Europe, the biggest problems like Brexit and all the others represent residues of the old ideas of nation state, the way the sovereignty has to be maintained and sustained at all costs. But for ASEAN, the problem is that we haven't even begun to be nation states yet. We are nation building, as I said, work in progress in the sense that all our little nations that came out of decolonization were not really nation states. We were countries, yes, given the kind of legitimacy by the United Nations, but none of us were really fully nations in the way that the nation states were created in Europe out of the great wars. Now, the fundamental thing was that those nation states were created because the big powers allowed them, and it was in the interest of the great powers, to let them remain. And what was the result? The result was the small nation states managed to preserve their sovereignty in Western Europe, but the great powers began to expand their empires elsewhere. So that they stopped fighting each other in Europe. They fought, in fact, in Africa, in Asia, and elsewhere. And they did the fighting to break up and carve up the world to have bigger and bigger empires. Now that was the 19th century. And then they were worried about that as well, but as I mentioned earlier on, it didn't prevent them from 2 world wars. So what kind of stability is that? International law that was worked out in the 19th century, all the efforts of these empires to avoid fighting each other in Europe and fought elsewhere. In the end, they fought in Europe as well. And what happened? It basically destroyed those old empires, which was good for us. But we now are in a very uncertain stage of building something. We're trying to build something, so we must not have too many vague hopes and expectations on the basis of the ideals that we used to have. We must be very hard-headed. So I must say that when Gillian asked me to answer the question, I put out those scenarios, I ended up by being very concerned that we should not allow ourselves to be carried away by some of those great ideals without recognizing some of the real realities. And the reality of the possibility of a second Cold War between the United States and China. I don't think it'll happen quite that way, but it could be something like it.
Yeah.
And that poses real problems for the whole question of nation states anyway.
Thank you. My question to Dr. Kong is, will globalization survive the rise of the angry voter?
Okay, well, for me, I'm very clear that globalization per se increases the size of the pie. It's how we divide that pie that is really the critical question for today, and that's essentially a political question.
Yes.
We can choose whatever means we like, but we have to recognize wherever we are that we are part of a community, society, and that needs to carry every member along with it. But I'll say something more, if I may, Prof. Ko.
Yes.
Because as we move into the next stage of globalization and the next stage of technology development, the 4th industrial revolution and so on, it may not be the poor, but increasingly it could be the middle class that could come under threat, under pressure from growing global competition, from declining living standards and so on. And let's remember that it was the breaking of the middle class in post-1918 Germany that gave rise to Nazism. So we see it's the middle class that is, to me, the crucial indicator to watch looking ahead at the next stage of globalization. And then on top of that, there's the element of trust. Because increasingly, there is a deficit of trust in political elites. So you referred to Brexit, and we even had a very prominent British politician saying, we've had enough of these experts. Expertise is no longer something to be valued, but to be derided. That leads us into very dangerous territory, in my view. But let me also be clear, we are all like that eminent politician. If you go to the doctor these days and he gives you a prescription for your ailments, do you just take the medicine? No, you check it out on Wikipedia.
You do that?
You do that.
Don't you trust your doctor?
Well, yeah, do you or don't you?
I do.
Many of us do.
I do.
We check it out, or we ask our friends on Facebook or whatever, what happened to you when you took this drug? And then we could challenge our doctor in turn. So trust has moved from vertical to horizontal. We trust our Facebook friends. That's the mantra for today. And that's a dangerous, though nevertheless, a dangerous but inevitable part of where we are today in today's interconnected world. I just checked on Wikipedia how many member states the United Nations has, and it tells me 193, not 197. Now, that doesn't mean Wikipedia is right. We live in a post-truth world.
Wikipedia is wrong.
There you go. There you go. So, who do we trust? What do we take? That's critical.
Okay. Thank you. I have 2 questions for Joe, quick one. Apart from China and the United States, which are the other great powers? And is de Gaulle's whole idea of neutralizing Southeast Asia a way out of having to choose between the United States and China?
Yeah. On the first question, when I was speaking, I was quite deliberate because I didn't want to get into this tangled discussion on what are the qualifications of great powerdom, what makes a great power great. So I used the term external powers, of which there are a number, external major powers. The obvious candidates, at least as far as our region is concerned, are Japan, India, Australia, and Russia. Okay, and
Australia,
in fact,
Australia,
it's not a great power. I think it's a major enough power to be factored into the equation. But we could get into a debate on that. But I think the main point is really to look into diversifying the kind of engagement that we have with the external players of consequence to regional affairs and deepening them as well. On the second question, I think actually Prof. Wang himself had helped me out really with your response to your question. But let me just mention that for Southeast Asia, we've attempted that, right? ASEAN attempted that with ZOPFAN, if we remember, way back in from 68 on to 71, the great discussion on neutrality, neutralism, neutralization, etc. So it was articulated in 1971 in the KL Declaration as an aspiration, which was repeated in the 76 ASEAN Accord, but it's never moved beyond aspirational, that aspirational stage. If you look at the region today, I think it is going to be tricky. It will be tricky for a number of reasons, chief of which is because if you look at the influence that external powers have played or already play in the region, they have been enmeshed into regional affairs already, and it was part of a deliberate strategy on ASEAN's part, immediately after the Cold War. So to now sort of undertake a major shift in terms of regional thinking on how we relate to the external powers, I think will be quite challenging. And number two, ASEAN has prided itself as being at the heart of a number of initiatives through which this enmeshment of external power interests has taken place, right? The ARF, ADMM+, EAS, and I think ASEAN's intent, as far as I can tell, is to continue to do their best to drive that process. But of course, the question is how receptive the external powers will be.
Provided we remain united and neutral.
Yes.
Okay, we have only 12 minutes left, so I'm going to take 3 questions at a time. 3 questions at a time. Let's take one from this end, one in the middle, and one from the left. Yes, please. Could you introduce yourself and put your question briefly to which panelist, if you could tell us, please? Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Darian. I just finished my national service and I'm waiting to go off to university. I have 2 questions for Professor Liao. So firstly, given that recognition of the One China principle has been the foundation of the Sino-US bilateral relationship since the 1970s, I've been quite disturbed by some of Trump's recent rhetoric about Taiwan. So my question is, as China and the US move towards a new modus vivendi, do you think that we will seriously see the US using adherence to One China as just another bargaining chip? My second question is, do you think that the upcoming 19th National Congress in China could be affecting Chinese foreign policy in terms of leaders perhaps playing more towards the domestic gallery? Thank you.
Thank you. I think the second question should be for Prof. Wang, who's one of the world leading authorities on China. First question for Joe.
Yes, I agree.
Yes, another question? Let's take 3. Yeah, please, just go to the microphone and introduce yourself. Dr. Gamin.
My name is
we give the lady first and then you. Yeah,
Thank you.
Don't go away. Please stand at the mic. Yeah, Min.
Thank you. Well, I'm a doctor, and I must tell Dr. Kong, we also check up our answers on Wikipedia. But yeah, my question is mainly directed to Dr. Kong. I would like to say that actually, I think globalization, as we know it, has already failed or is rapidly failing. Well, as Dr. Kong has said, there is lack of trust now in the current system of globalization. And
What's
once
your
you've
question?
lost-
What's your question for
So,
Dr. Kong?
I want to ask him, or any of the other panel members, if globalization fails, globalization in the current model that is supposed to be a rising tide that raises all boats but has not, Singapore's success, Singapore's, in fact, exceptionalism is premised on this model of globalization. So how are we going to survive? I think the hard choice that faces us is not choosing between US and China, is how we are going to change our model and succeed in the new globalization, which we don't even know what.
Okay, so the question for Dr. Kong is, how will Singapore survive if globalization fails? Yes, you please.
Okay. My name is Shamsher Zaman. I am ambassador to Jordan. My question is that if US withdraws from this region in terms of defense cooperation and defense relationship, there will be a gap. How it will affect Singapore and the region, and whether any ideas who will fill this gap? Thank you.
So your question is, I guess for all three of them, what are the consequences of US withdrawal from the region? Yeah, I don't think anybody in Washington talking about withdrawal, you know. I think that that we must make an important distinction between isolationism, which means withdrawal, and unilateralism. I think the Trump administration is more unilateralist. I don't think it's isolationist. The person who's been nominated to be the next Secretary of State, Mr. Rex Tillerson, has in fact made some very strong statements about what the United States intend to do in the South China Sea. So this is not the statement of a future Secretary of State that wishes to withdraw from the region. But anyway, thank you for your question. Let me see if are there any other questions? Yes, please. Yes. Barry Desker. Ambassador Barry Desker.
Thank you, Tommy. My question to the panel is, all of you actually represent internationalist, supranational perspectives. But in a world where connectivity is increasing, we are having instead the opposite occurring at the local level.
Yeah.
Primordial loyalties are being emphasized. Yeah. Loyalties to clan, religion, language, and ethnicity. How do we deal with the challenge that this poses?
Thank you. Well, that's what I was referring to by the angry voter, no? You're right, the four of us here are all part of the global elite, no? So I guess your question, no, it's a very important question, no? And we should all be worried about the rise of the angry voter in the West. People who feel left out of trade liberalization, economic integration, globalization. They fear they'll be victims of the fourth industrial revolution. But Dr. Kong has warned us, the victims will not just be the working class, it will also be the middle class. So let's get a panel to respond to these questions. Let's start on this end, Dr. Kong.
Okay, so if globalization fails in its current model, what about Singapore? Because Singapore's success is premised on this particular model of globalization. Well, all I will say is that we don't know which way the international order could move. It could move to a world of hardening nation states, that's how it looks at the moment, but it could equally move to a world in which connectivity means that it's people rather than governments that are more empowered. Whether they're right or wrong, they will push for certain things. And in a very fast-moving people power world, it may well be smaller entities that are more nimble in adjusting their model of national success that could be more successful than big lumbering states who could turn out to be the dinosaurs of the future. So if I could just unfold another question that was raised, which is, relates to the U.S. We know, for instance, that the U.S., the new U.S. president has talked about withdrawing from Paris COP21. Whether he's able to do so, that's a different matter, but he's talked of his desire to do so. Now, it may well be that things are already moving in the United States, market forces, initiatives by local state governments that will actually carry on that momentum on dealing with climate, irregardless of what the White House says. So we may well find that action is happening, but not necessarily where you think it is, at the locus of national power.
Thank you. Gang Hu, what can we expect from the 19 People's Congress? And what are the consequences if the new administration in Washington does not honor the One China policy, which is a foundational principle of US-China relations?
Well, this is a very sensitive subject, as you know, for the Chinese, partly because they have, from the very beginning, looked upon the whole history of China in terms of their own civil war, which was fought between 1945 and 49 with the victory of the Chinese Communist Party. And the Communist Party has interpreted that to mean that their job is not yet finished until the country is totally unified. That's the fundamental argument. And so when we talk about one China, we have to bear that in mind. In the eyes of the Chinese, they're not yet one China. They're sort of one and a bit. And they want to make sure that it becomes one China. Of course, if you want to be really facetious about it, one can ask whether the United States is one United States today. There are really doubts that some of the divisions within the United States will last for a little while and be quite a job for somebody like President Trump to really bring the United States together again. At least that would be quite a test for his presidency. But the question of oneness goes back to this idea of the sovereign nation-state idea. When Professor Barry Desker asked the question about other more primordial instincts, of course there are. In fact, they are very, very important. And one of the reasons why nation-states were created in the first place was try to get away from some of these primordial instincts. I mean, there was the war of religion in Europe that led to such terrible killings for hundreds of years before they finally agreed on the Treaty of Westphalia, was trying to cut down so that they don't fight on the basis of religion. And as far as race is concerned, of course, this spread out. Once that was set out, it meant the white man conquering the rest of the world and causing a lot of racial divisions and other divisions. But of course, throughout the world, throughout history, there have always been tribes and nations and other loyalties, and they still exist. They will not go away. Nation-states have not got rid of them. Nation-states have tried to contain them, and by building a successful nation, you manage to, one of the marks of a successful nation is you can keep all these primordial instincts down to a minimum. And that's all you can hope for, so that the people will turn their loyalty to something new called a nation-state. But I still say this is very much work in progress. And not only in Asia, in Southeast Asia, it's pretty obvious it's work in progress. But even elsewhere, even in a country like Europe, they are still facing problems of nation building. There is by no means a kind of job you declare it's finished, it's done, the job is done. It is going to go on, and these tensions within nations will always be a source, something that other nations can exploit, and it will always be something that you've got to watch out for. So I end by simply saying that whether it's China, United States, or the small nations, the business of trying to build a nation, one nation, is a very tough job, and it never stops.
Thank you, Kang. Joe, you will have the last word, so be brief. Huh?
Okay.
Two very important questions. One, will the United States withdraw from the region? And number two, in spite of all the interdependencies between the United States and China, is it possible to envisage a future conflict between the US and China? Bearing in mind the two big lessons from World War I. Lesson number one, economic interdependence is not a guarantee of peace. And number two, one should never underestimate man's capacity for irrational behavior.
Fair enough. Okay, very quickly, my responses. On the first point about withdrawal, I don't expect to see a withdrawal as such. I think the US will still be in the region. In fact, you could turn that argument around and say that the concern is miscalculated escalation. You know, like if what Rex Tillerson envisages on as far as the U.S. policy on the South China Sea is concerned, for example, you know, so that is not that doesn't look like withdrawal to me. The second issue, and if I can tie that in very quickly to the point about Taiwan, I think that for the Trump administration, they are or Trump himself actually, he's staring at a very curious contradiction. That is to say that if Trump was to sort of renege on the one China policy, which I think would be very foolish of him to do, then the Chinese, of course, are going to up the ante for sure, right? Then the question begs, what is Trump going to do? How is he going to respond? Is he going to send carriers through the Taiwan Straits? Is he going to really
troops in Taiwan?
Yeah, exactly. Escalate to the point of conflict. If he does, then one recalls his statement at his inaugural address that enough of this defending friends at the expense of the American people. So how are you going to sort out that sort of cognitive dissonance there?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. So please join me in thanking the three panelists.